Good evening. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Michael Worthington. Michael received his academic training at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. He is a specialist in tree ring dating or dendrochronology. He has dated buildings as diverse as the Fairbanks House, the oldest frame house in English America, to Josiah Henson's house, also known as Uncle Tom's Cabin in Montgomery County, and a 17th century shipwreck just for fun in there, and a lot of other locations which he'll be talking about. I won't belabor the introduction. I will just bring Dr. Worthington on up.
Oops, let me just break everything. Okay, thank you, Silas. So I'm going to do a talk on dendrochronology. First of all, I'm going to do a little introduction on what dendrochronology is, just in case any of you don't know what it is. And if you've had questions, we'll do questions on that afterwards, because it can get a bit complicated. But I'll just try and do a quick summary of what dendrochronology is, as I'm a dendrochronologist. So when you were children, I'm sure you did this. You got a tree and you counted the rings in the tree, and you could say how old that tree was. I'm sure it's something that you all did. What you weren't told when you were a child was the width of the rings were actually different. You can see here there's wide rings here, you can see narrow rings over here. And the reason that is because trees are natural things, they're plants, and they're affected by climate. So if you get a warm, wet year, you get a wide ring like these. So this must have been a very warm period of time here. And when you get a period of drought or a lot of rain, and you get this narrow ring. This guy here, Andrew Douglas, he was an astronomer who was working on the west coast in Arizona, and he was basically the first person who realized that you could actually study these rings and actually get information out of them. And what he managed to do was he managed to work out a very simple way of recording the information in one tree, and so that you could then walk to another tree and get the information from that and compare the two. So this is a set of data from a tree that he sampled, and this is a set of another tree that he sampled. So you can see basically by doing his very simple graph, the idea of this is if you get a very wide ring, you put a short mark on it. Where you get a very narrow ring, you put a longer mark on it. And by taking this data onto this bits of paper, you can basically compare two trees. And he was basically doing this across hilltops as they were building this new observatory. But if you think about this for a second, if you've got two trees next to each other and you can compare the information in those two trees, what happens if you're in a wood and there's a tree on the floor that's already dead? It's already died. So let's look at these. So let's say. So you know the date of the tree because you're standing there, so you can assign the date to it. The tree that's on the floor that's dead obviously doesn't have the modern rings in it. So if you look at this now, what you've got is you've got a set of data here which are dated because you sampled this tree, and now you have a set of data that you've actually dated by comparing it to this one. So if you transfer the dates from here to here, you suddenly know when this tree fell down. So the tree in the woods we now know fell over whatever 10 years before the tree that you were actually sampled. And also what you've done is, because you've got your first tree only has 60 odd rings in it, this one here starts giving you more rings. So here you can only go back to 1940. You can actually go to 1910. And if you carry on doing that, going further and further back, you end up with longer and longer chronologies, which means you can date anything in that area. So let's just have a look at what the trees on the west coast. You can clearly see here, wide rings are very clear, narrow rings are very obvious as well. And when Douglas was working over in Arizona, he could actually look at a piece of wood and date it just by looking at it. On this side of the country, we have a problem, which is rain. We have so much rain over here compared with Arizona. These are two samples out of two trees And you can hardly, you can see this area here is sort of wider. You can see there's 2 rings here, but you can't really do what they're doing here. So what we do is, on this side of the country, we use basically graphs. And basically we measure every single ring, not just the odd wide ones. We measure every single ring, and we basically set up a set of graphs that we can compare, the same as he was comparing it, but 2 pieces of graphic going ding, 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 and there we have a match. And we got the same thing here. We know the date here, so we can assign the date to we know the date of the blue one, so we can pass the date on to the red one. So the first thing you do, go out into the woods, take a sample of your tree. There's your tree. You take a sample of an older building, a bit of archaeology maybe, and you can build these long chronologies that basically mean you can date anything. And the chronologies are not just 1 or 2 samples, there are lots and lots of samples. So this is a chronology from Boston, and you can see it has about 50 different buildings in here. So that's basically dendrochronology. Right, that's boring. Let's go talk about buildings. The other thing, obviously, you have to think about is when you build these chronologies, they don't match huge areas. They match certain areas which are dependent on climate, geography, geology. So there's lots of reasons, limitations on these chronologies, so you need to make lots and lots of them. When you're in when we're sort of doing buildings, I'll just jump into buildings now. The things we're looking for are samples with complete sapwood, samples are complete with lots of rings in. Things that we don't sample when we're working on buildings is reused pieces. These are rafters in the roof of Salisbury Cathedral in England. This is a brace and this is a truss, and we're sort of looking up into the roof, and you can clearly see this piece of wood has got a joint in it that doesn't fit this building at all. So if you sample this piece of wood here, you'll get the wrong date for this building. So when we're working on buildings, we've spent a lot of time looking at that. The other thing we've got to look out for is repairs. So here is a building in North Wales where had very extensive repairs on it, and you can clearly see that if you sample this piece of wood here, you're not going to get the date of this here. You're going to get the date of when they repaired the building. So that's basically dendrochronology summed up very quickly. So without dendrochronology, how do we date buildings? We use one of these. This is an architect historian in the wild. And what these guys do is they study buildings. And the things they're looking for they're looking at nails, they're looking at different floor plans, they're looking at moldings around doors and windows and things. They're looking at doors, windows, fixtures and fittings, and they're also looking at documents. And every time you look at a every time they go to a new building, they look at all these, they look to record all these things, draw all these things, and make a record of it. And eventually you end up with a group of buildings. So I'm going to do a very, very simple graphic. If we have an architectural historian in the room, I'm really sorry to make your job into one slide, but I'm going to try. So here we go. Here's a group of buildings that we're studying. So you can clearly see quite quickly that we have 2 different types of building here. We have an older looking building which doesn't have a chimney stack and has no windows, so it's very cold and dark. And then you have, so we can group those together. And then we have another set of buildings which are, they've got a chimney stack, so they're nice and warm, and they've got windows that are nice and light. So we can group those together. And then as you carry on studying buildings, you find another one that's got another slight variant on this, like this one here, which doesn't have the windows but has the chimney stack. You can say, well, that must have been built in between there. So now you've got basically a sequence of buildings and building types. And obviously, this is very simple. They'll be looking at everything, moldings, they'll be looking at all the things we've said to get this. And once you start getting these together, you can start putting a chronological date on them. And this is how architecture historians work. Very complicated, but that's a very simple way of seeing what they do. These are some very good books if you're interested in studying in further reading on this. This Chesapeake book from Virginia, extremely good book on what architecture historians do. This is one from Massachusetts. The problem with this one is it was done before the Dendro, so you have to be a little bit careful with the dates in this one. But this one, most of the dates in here are really good, although within a week of this going out, we'd changed the date of one of the buildings in it, so we have to be a little bit careful. how good are architect historians? So this is a house from the Eastern Shore. Maryland Historic Trust basically did a study of this building, came up with a date of 1829. A new owner bought this house and basically wanted it to be in the 1700s. So they called me out, and sometimes you get a job and you just think, this is going to be a bad day, and this is my bad day. So I get called out by Maryland Historic Trust saying they've got this guy who wants this building to be older than the date they think it is. I come out, and I'm saying to him, I said, look, Maryland Historic Trust is saying this is what they think the date is. You're wasting your money having me here, because these guys are pretty good. They've seen a lot of buildings in a small area. They've studied hundreds of buildings, maybe even thousands of buildings. And the person who wrote this report, Orlando Reinhardt V, is one of the best. He's not with us anymore, but he is one of the best architect historians in Maryland. But the guy still wanted dating, so I dated it for him, and it was exactly the same date. So that's how good an architect historian can be if you get a good one. So when I was asked to do this paper, I was asked to talk about a dendrochronology project that was based here in St. Mary's City, basically, as I was saying earlier, let me just jump this bit. So basically, I was asked to do this. So I'm basically going to talk about a project that was not done by me. It was done by a group of. So basically, it was done by a dendrochronologist called Jack Heikkinen. It was done by an architect historian, and it was done by basically another architect historian who also did the administration. And then I'm also going to put in Carrie Carson here because he went through after this was done and did a lot of work on the buildings and produced a lot of the reports. So I'm basically going to talk about their project. The funding for this, we always need to talk about funding, was through, well, there you go, you can see where it's funded. So I'm just going to talk about this. So the objective of the project was to produce an oak master chronology. In this area we have basically three major woods that we can do dendrochronology on. One's oak, one is tulip poplar, and the other one is pine. This was very early, and they wanted to basically do the oak chronology. A lot of the early buildings are oak, so the idea was to produce an oak chronology so they could date oak buildings. It was a very quick project, only 16 months to do this. It's very quick, actually. They looked at 38 sites, and of that, they chose 4 old growth sites and 20 historic sites. The historic sites are not just one building. Sometimes they would date extra buildings on the site. So in the end, we ended up with 32 phases of building. This is a map of the area that the study was. We all know where we are as we live here. It's actually a fantastic place. If you were going to do a study on dendrochronology as a dendrochronologist, this is perfect place to do it. You've got a small geographic area, sort of 50 miles by 40 miles. You basically have old growth wood, which a lot of the country doesn't have because it's been logged, and you have a group of fabulous buildings that you can work on. The other thing is you're away from the mountains over here, you're away from the ocean here, so you have this little island in the middle here, which is basically perfect, and all those buildings are basically having the same reaction to the same climate. So it makes it a perfect site for doing the study. So that's where we are, and you can see this is it's on the eastern shore, but looking back towards here. But you can see how flat this area is. So it's very perfect. All the buildings basically should be reacting the same. So we should be able to they should be able to match them together really well. So they went out, took loads of cores from trees, chainsawed pieces of trees. They drilled buildings, sawed pieces out of buildings, something I don't like doing, but back in the day that's what they did. And from that, they managed to produce a chronology from the living trees, these 4 sites. This is the date ranges for each of the sites. This one's quite short, but I think they were having a lot of trouble when they were doing it, finding old growth trees. So with all this average together, they managed to make a chronology of 250 years from 1730 through to 1980. If you add 50 to this date here, it basically says they've got a 200-year range that they can date buildings in. So from 1780 to 1980, any building built in that period they can date with this chronology. So that's a great jump back that they managed to do. So these are the buildings they dated, and this is the chronological order of the dates that their report had. And you can clearly see when they were looking for buildings, this is sort of very textbook. They found some later buildings. They didn't usually, when you do projects, you're trying to jump and date all these old ones, but they actually really did a really good job and got a nice sort of overlapping set of buildings and produced this. So they're your modern trees, and these are each of the buildings. And you can see how these all overlap, so you get better and better data. And they ended up with this chronology, which basically you can date basically any buildings in this area with. Fabulous bit of work. Now we get into the controversy of it, of course. As you all know, people sitting in this room, when the dates came out and were published, we lost some of our old buildings. So here's Holly Hill, date 1670. The project date came in 1698. Another one, Cedar Park, 1699, moves to 1702. Obviously, a lot of people got very upset about this, but as a dendrochronologist, this is what happens. Anyway, I'm just going to leave that for a little bit and then talk about me for a while, and then we might come back to this. So we just quickly took, Jack did basically this chronology here. After he left here, he went and did a project in Williamsburg. He then did a project in North Carolina. So now he can basically date anything in this area here. Not this side, not that side of the mountains. Along the seaboard is difficult, but in this sort of inner inboard area here, he can basically date anything. Now I'll talk about me. Okay. So I'm a dendrochronologist from England. The projects I've worked on range from very, very tiny little houses to huge places like these castles. So this is Tower London. We basically dated every single phase of this building. A lot of what you see up here actually isn't medieval. It's actually in the 1730s and 40s when they put these towers on. I've also worked on a place like Windsor Castle, which has an amazing wooden cloister inside that we were working on. And this is Chepstow Castle, one of the other castles that we did. And this one is a museum site now. What I love about this building is when we came in here, the story of this building was the castle. This is the outer castle wall, but there's an inner bit which they reckon was the oldest part. We came along, and in this doorway here, we found a door, which is now in storage, and we dated it to these dates, made it the oldest surviving door in Britain at the time, and also completely changed the history of the site. So the outside walls were earlier than they thought, so the castle basically had to rewrite the guidebook, which is one of my favorite things in my job. I also worked on lots of cathedrals. In actual fact, in England, the dendrochronology, we were all assigned a cathedral, so I was given 4. These are 3 of the cathedrals I was assigned, so basically we come in and we date all the little bits of roofs in here, and whenever there's any work on there, we go in there and do more dendrochronology. And an offshoot of that, when I was working on Winchester Cathedral in Hampshire, this cathedral has amazing archives. So this is what's called a cathedral roll, and there's thousands of these that survive. And a lot of the information here is the day-to-day running of the cathedral. And the cathedral's like a big money-making machine. It owns a huge amount of land, and it records everything it does. So in this document, you've actually got examples of them paying foresters to go out into the woods, cut down trees, sawyers to come in and cut those trees into buildings, masons to come along and build those buildings, and then you've got the first day the building's rented out. And you can find that in these documents. So what we did was we went and looked for some of those buildings. This building's been messed around with a lot. It's had brick cladding on it. This is a very old building under here. And we could basically look at the records, look at the building, do the dendro, and we'd actually work out from a dendro date that we give you, a building of this size is built within 6 months to a year of that date. So we managed to do a project like that. We're doing a project similar to that here in America, where we're looking at the buildings in Old Salem, where they equally have fantastic records. This is my favorite building in England. So this is St Mary's Church in Kempley. When I was training to be a dendrochronologist, I went to the lab where English Heritage trains you, and I'm the new lad, and basically they said they didn't know what to do with me. They basically said, go in the in the storeroom and see what you can find. And in the back of the workshop, in the storeroom, there was boxes of these samples from this building, and I did them as my first job. I got this date. Turns out to be the oldest building standing building in England. There are older buildings, but there's no wood in them. So this is a complete building. The tower is later, it's 14 something, but this area here dated to this. And basically the report went from me dating this building to about 10 people on names on the report. So America. So when I came over to America in about 2000, I started work in Massachusetts. I came on the second part of the project, so the living tree side of the project had already been done, because the majority of dendrochronology is not done to date buildings. It's done for climate research, forest research, fire research. So the tree guys had come in onto this hilltop in Massachusetts, and where you can see this ski resort went in, they basically took samples of these trees that were felled, and it turned out these trees were basically 500 years old. And bad for the trees, but great for dendrochronology, because we suddenly have a chronology that goes back 500 years, which means we can now go straight into New England and start dating buildings up there. So we did a huge project where we looked at a lot of the classic buildings in New England, these sort of great big saltbox houses. So we basically went around there looking at them. I'm not going to go into them because we spent all night talking about it, but what we did do, which basically has sort of, I don't know, it sort of helps to explain Jack's work, I think, is what I'm going to say. So what we did was, after we did some president houses as well. After we had dated a lot of buildings up there, we did about 60. We went through all the historic structures reports for those buildings, and every single building that we had a date for, that we also had a professional architectural historian's date for, we logged on this graph. So the red ones are the dendro dates, the blue triangles are the architect historian's dates. And you can see there's a huge amount of buildings which were dated too early, and this is the ones that people in New England get really upset about, because this group of buildings here that used to be before 1660 suddenly jump up 20, 30 years later. So it's very much like the situation we have here on the western shore of Maryland, where Jack came in and completely changed the dates. We did exactly the same up here. So the question has to be why. This is another graph of that. Basically, you can see it's basically twice as many buildings. Half of the buildings we've moved the date forward. About a third, about a quarter stay the same, and just over a quarter we move back. So now and again we do move buildings back, but as you can see, it's not as common as moving them the other way. So I think the reason for me as a dendrochronologist, I move buildings dates all the time, and I think this is basically the main block that people get, the mistake that architectural historians make, owners make. This is my house in Baltimore. The great thing about Baltimore is we have every single record. There was a fire in Baltimore, but it didn't burn the records. So we have every single time your house is sold, we have a copy of the lease or the transaction, should we say. We have all the tax records. We have all the insurance maps. We have basically everything. People do projects where they can basically tell you what dates the population changes, so you can see the waves of Polish people coming and the Irish people coming, and you can see it in the documents. It's just absolutely amazing. So this is my house, and if you read this document, like you probably all read it by now, in 1799, the plot of land my house was built on was sold, and you had to build a house within 3 years worth £20, and if you didn't, you got fined $20 a year. So if you read this document, you could easily fall into the trap of saying this house is within 3 years of that date. And I think that is what a lot of the problems with the architect historians is. I think a lot of them are actually just spending too much time looking at the documents rather than looking at the fixtures and fittings. Because if you look at this house from the outside, this is a federal style house. It could easily be that date. But if you go into my house and you start looking at the fixtures and fittings, this door frame here is original, the staircase is original in this house, the frame, the moldings around the windows are original. You will see it's later. Well, that's the dendro date for it. And that's what the date of all the fixtures and fittings in this house is. So what I'm seeing is basically is people not looking at everything and just jumping on one thing. And this is another one. So this is a house over in Western Virginia. When we arrived on this site, the date's not really important, but basically the story of this house that I was being given by the people who work on it was you've got two phases of building. You've got a frame section and then you've got a brick section. And the story was that the frame section was built first, and then when the owners made some more money, they then built the brick section. So that's the story that we arrived to this building. So when we dated it, it basically turned out that both parts of the building are exactly the same date. And later. So the question is, what happened here? There's a fire. The building burnt down. The owner had a new building built exactly the same as the old one. Now you might say that's crazy. My father-in-law has had 2 house fires, and both times he rebuilt the building exactly the same as it was in the beginning. My father-in-law loves 1970s rancher houses. So that's what you've got here. So basically, it's about looking at everything, I think, is what I'm trying to say. So there's another building we did. This is the Fairbanks House, as Silas said, oldest colonial house that we've dated so far. There's a couple of other buildings. It's the only one out of the ones on that graph that actually stayed as late as it was, although I dated it to, sort of winter 1741. On the chimney stack, it still says 1636, and they won't take it off. So, even though I dated it. Anyway, down here I've worked on buildings like Mount Vernon. The project here was, when we arrived at Mount Vernon, the architect historians had done a lot of work on this building. They do a huge amount of work on this building. It's absolutely phenomenal. They have a GIS reconstruction of this building where if you walk in and you point at a nail, they have an entry in their GIS system for that nail. It's absolutely phenomenal. Anyway, when they're working on this, they found there's very strange timbers in the basement which don't really quite fit this building. So when we came in and did dendrochronology on it, we found out that although George Washington built the house you can see, actually inside this house is his father's house from 1735. It's still inside here. So that was a great find on that one. Jack and I have worked at Colonial Williamsburg, and Colonial Williamsburg has this fantastic map called the Frenchman's Map from 1782. And basically, every time there's any work on any building that survives that's on this map, we come in and do dendrochronology. And they do, the architect historians do all the work, and we come in and basically change it. So this house here, the Robert Carter house, actually shouldn't be the Robert Carter house. His father built that house. So we do that. So this is a project I am doing right now. There's a building on the Eastern Shore called Clover Fields. This is basically a big gentry house, an important person for that area. With these big houses, you get this sort of thing where family gets a lot of money, builds big house, family starts to run out of money, house runs down, and quite often the house is then sold because they've got no money. Or somebody else in the family gets a lot of money and they start doing work on it, and then it starts running down again. This house is going through a period where the family now has a lot of money, and they're basically doing a total restoration of not only the house, but of the landscape the house sat in. So we are doing dendrochronology, they're doing archaeology, they're doing paint analysis, they're doing geophysics, they've done LiDAR reconstructions, so you can see the gardens and things. They're doing archaeology on the gardens. They're just doing everything. They've got a full-time historian, they have a full-time architecture historian. They're bringing in craftsmen to do very specific sort of repairs and things like that. It's a phenomenal project. The interesting thing about this building is is these principles here. It's called a bent principle. Very unusual. There's only 3 buildings surviving with that. We'll talk about another one of those in a moment. You can see, maybe you can see, this is a photograph of the side of the house. You can see it's got this funny roof, but you can see here the line where the roof originally was. So you can see basically there's been lots of chopping and changing on the back of this house. So when we arrived on the site, I'm just going to rewrite that so you can read it. We got a date, the architecture historians have come to us with a date of 1730 on this house, and then periods of, so basically that's that part there. So you've got a front section of the house and a stair tower. So that's the front section. The photograph we were looking at was from this side. This is a stair tower, and then they basically put 2 extras in the mid-18th century. They put these 2 sections in here and then mess around with the roof, and then they put down there. So this was the basic story. I've gone through it very quickly. There's a basic story that they had. But with the project that we're doing at the moment, we're basically doing a lot more work, and we now understand the building a lot better. So this is the modern interpretation. It probably changed since this was I actually got a copy of this because they're doing so much work on it. So the first thing you'll notice is we push this building back. So we push this building back to 1704-05 winter of, and that's basically this shape of building. So we basically moved from being the date of the building basically makes it one of the few buildings in this period. We managed to get a date for this here, 1728-29. We couldn't get a date for this raising here because when they put this cat slide roof on, they took all the timber out. So we couldn't do dendro there, but we could do a dendro when the roof went on. So we know the window that fitted. The architect historians are doing more work on that so they can try and work it out. And then the back building is just unbelievable. There's about 10 phases of change and swapping around in the back there, which you could do a whole lecture on. And they have a web page which has basically all their research on it. And if anybody's interested, if you look on the internet, you can find basically that they've done videos of it, blogs of it, all kinds of stuff. Pretty amazing project. So anyway, let's go back to Jack rather than talking about other stuff. So when I first came to America and was starting working in this area, I read Jack's reports, but unfortunately back then there was no way of getting Jack's data. Jack had done approximately 200, 250 buildings, I think, but Jack got ill, had mental health issues, and basically became estranged from his family, and we lost all his data, we lost all his samples, which is a huge loss for dendrochronology and for the history of this area. So when I came over here, one of my goals was to try and find some of Jack's stuff. So basically I started talking to the family, I started talking to the university that he worked at, and basically just hassling people, just look on your computer, you might have something in there. And after 5 years of hassling the family and the university, one day the family were clearing out an old storage locker they had, and in the back of the storage locker they found 3 of Jack's filing cabinets, which although they didn't have his samples, had a lot of his notes for his sites, had his site books that he used to record his sites, and it also had 150 5.5-inch floppy disks, each one with a name on, so we know which site is on the floppy disk. Each floppy is basically a backup. Floppy disk didn't hold very much. He put all the information from one site onto that as a backup. His data doesn't have any metadata in it, so you can't, it's very hard to work out what it is, because it doesn't say, you open the file up, it doesn't say, this is such and such. It's just a list of numbers and a code. So basically, I've been spending literally the last 5 years trying to work out what those codes mean. Some of them are easy, because the disk will actually have the full name on. Some of them, it's just a code. So I'm asking architecture historians, hey, you work with Jack, what was the building called? And the codes basically are things like Ocean Hall. Ocean Hall would be OH. So basically, I'm trying to ask people, what code could this be? What buildings have you worked? So I think we spent a lot of time doing that. And I've now sort of got a big spreadsheet with all this information in. And when Silas asked me to do this talk tonight, I thought, rather than me just, like I just did, talk about Jack's project, I thought, why don't I actually re-look at Jack's work? I've got some of his data. So I went through all the files I had, all the disks I had, and of the living trees that he sampled, I've got 2 sets of that data. Reading Jack's report, he couldn't date those 2, so there's no data for those. And then going through all the buildings I've got and all the floppy disks I've got, I don't have data for those 4. But what I do have data for is all of this. So basically, in the last few weeks, I've basically been rerunning Jack's data. Now, what I've done is I've gone through the disks and worked out what is his master chronology. So I haven't gone to the individual samples for each site. I've just gone for the master chronology he made for the site. I've then taken that and compared that with my data. So totally independently dating Jack's work. That's basically the goal of what I did. So without going through every single site, I'll just put lists on. So the 2 modern tree sites worked perfectly fine. Fantastic. This list of buildings here and phases, so you've got, in Holly Hill, you've got 2 phases of building, you saw the picture. We managed to date that. All this line here date perfectly with my data. So basically, if I had gone out onto these sites and sampled these sites, I would have no problem dating them. You can see Jack's date for Cedar Park and Holly Hill are correct. So the problems we've been having about Jack changing buildings, he was right. We do, though, have a number of sites here of this data that I couldn't date. So, and there could be a lot of reasons for this. So basically, the first thing I did was look at Jack's report, see what his reports don't have as much information as a report nowadays will, but it does have this table, which basically has the site, how many samples he took, and how long his chronology for each site was. So looking at that, Dixon's and Sarum, I'm not sure why those 2 don't date. They've got lots of samples. They've got fairly long ring sequences. Maybe rerunning the data, you might find something. I don't know. But what I did find was this one. This site here, he basically took some samples. He took 4 samples. He got a 30-ring chronology. Well, back in the 70s and the 80s, when dendro was first being done on the East Coast, they would do short sequences. Now we don't. I don't do anything below 50 rings. So if I get on a building and the wood looks like there's only 50 rings in the wood, I'm off home. So basically, Jack is doing things that today I wouldn't do. And if you look at the rest of the list, you'll see there's actually 4 buildings on that list that basically today I wouldn't bother sampling. We'd go off and do something else. So what would be a really good idea would be to go back and look at those buildings. Obviously, we're only doing this for this talk this week. It's difficult to do that. But sort of in serendipity, I guess, one of the gentlemen in the audience here basically owns one of the houses here. And he was always worried about Jack's dates. He's a man who likes things. He likes to sort of know things. He likes things to be right, I think, is the best way I can describe the gentleman. And basically, he was always worried about Jack, and he tried to get Jack to come back and do more work, and Jack really just wasn't interested. Jack's a difficult guy. I think Silas said the best description of Jack. Jack was a marine and a forester, and he arrived boots first. So take that how you want to take it. That was Jack. Anyway, so here's Ocean Hall. Fabulous house. Jamie, who's the owner of the house, has actually written a book on this house, and it's not like a little pamphlet like the local historical society do. It's an actual 1.25 inch thick tome of a book, recording basically every single thing he did, every single thing he found, and using Jack's date. But he was never happy with it. So when he found out I was working in the area, last year he called me up and said, "You've got to come and sort this out for me." So Jack only got a chronology that was 40 years in length, which I think is the main problem why this building there's problems with it. So I came in, and we basically, Jamie and I crawled all around the roof. We took samples out of it everywhere we could. Unfortunately, we didn't have the same access that Jack had, because Jack was there when the house was being restored. We're there now while people live there. But we did manage to take a sample out of a chimney stack, a lintel and a chimney stack that had a lot of rings. So we managed to produce, rather than a 40-year chronology for this building, we produced a 127-year chronology for this building. And with that, we managed to date it to that. So we basically, Jack was wrong on this one. So it basically suggests we should go back and look at the other ones that he got wrong with the short sequences. But this dates really well. This is the date of this building. Jamie's now writing a new paragraph for his book about the new dating. So, sorry. So what else am I doing? So, as we've seen, there's dendrochronology in New England. Basically, there's dendrochronology from New England down to basically the Carolinas on historic buildings. There's very little in Georgia. So there's some oak buildings on the northwest of the state. And I'm in a project at the moment where we're basically doing exactly what Jack did, but in the center of the state. We've got samples of trees from the tree guys again, but we're going out to these sort of really isolated historic buildings between Athens and Atlanta, and we're basically trying to produce a chronology for it's loblolly pine these buildings are made out of. So we're trying to make a chronology that we can start dating these buildings. So far we've sampled 10 buildings, of which we've managed to date 8, 5 of which are later than they thought, and the other 3 are sort of, about right. I go back next week and I'm going to do another 5 buildings, and next year we've got money to do another 5 buildings. So that's one project I'm doing. The thing I'm doing tomorrow is the ships that they found in Alexandria. I'm sure you've read that in your newspapers, online and everything. So basically, when these were found, I went in and dated, so I tried to date them. This is the one that was under the Indigo Hotel. We managed to get a date for that one. We found out that the wood came from New England rather than the Chesapeake. So we know this ship was built up in New England. These 2 ships, which are the latest ones they found, there's a third one, but there's hardly anything left. We tried dating it, but we couldn't. So at the moment, these timbers have been taken from the site. They're in a warehouse. It's actually a large old bus station. And Texas A&M are scanning them and doing a 3-dimensional reconstruction of them. And I'm going back in tomorrow to basically go behind these guys and sample it and hopefully get a date for it. So that's basically my talk. So I have one question for you people. This is the only set of samples that we have of Jack Heikkinen that survived. They've never been processed, and we have a code of BW. So if anybody knows of a building that BW matches, that Jack dated but you never got a date for, let me know. Thank you. Questions? Sir? Yep.
How do you sample these trees without destroying the ring structure?
Yeah, basically, let's just zoom back to the beginning there. We basically have special increment borers. It's a very thin piece of steel with a thread on the end. It was designed by tree people, and forestry people use them for going into plantation woodland where they're growing wood for timber. You drill in the tree, you can measure the rings, and you can do a calculation about how much wood you have in the lot. So we use these specialists. They're all made in Sweden. They're really, really expensive. But when we drill into the tree, what the tree will do, will I can't say this word. Basically, the tree will heal round the core, so it doesn't do that much damage. It potentially can do damage to trees, but if you're careful, it doesn't. So that's how we do trees.
My husband's sitting back there, so he doesn't have to be with me when I ask this question. But I still don't understand how you get the rings off of wood that is not necessarily the whole tree or I can't, I just don't know enough about it. So you go in and get lots of samples so that you can have comparisons within the same building?
Yeah, so what we're doing, if you go into a building and you take one sample, you go in, take one sample, there's a possibility that it could be original to that building. There's also a possibility that could be a reused piece. It also could be a repair. So what we do is we go in, I take the minimum of 10, sometimes 15, depending on where I am. And basically, when we come to date it, the chances are, if there's one that's a funny date, you'll see it. So that's one reason for taking lots of samples. The other thing, by taking a group of samples out of the building, when we come to average them together and match them together, if one tree at some point got ill, I don't know, it got struck by lightning, got disease, got insect attack, it'll stop reacting to climate. Its limiting factor to growth will not be climate, it will be the disease or the mechanical incident that happened to it. So if you get lots of samples and average them together, you'll average that little bit out. Then you get a much cleaner set of data. The data then holds more of the climate signal that you're looking for and will date better.
But it won't be possible to get those when, let's say, a building is steel with then some wood, but it's flat wood.
As long as there's wood in it, we can date it. Flat wood, it just depends, but every single building is different on how you're going to sample it. So you can take cores, you can take photographs of the ends of beams, you can cut sections out of the building. So there's lots of ways of getting that information out of the building. But if I get there and I can't take it, I move on and go to the next building. So
Thank you.
yeah, it's why you pay me to do it rather than somebody else, because I'm the expert at finding that piece of wood. And it basically can be, you're looking for a piece of complete sapwood, which could be in the building. There might be 3 spots an inch wide in that building, and they're the 3 samples you need to take to date that building, and I'm going to find them. So
And some kinds of wood do better than others.
yeah, so oak is the best. It just sucks in that climate, so it's wonderful. Pine has this nasty habit. If it gets any kind of stress, it will suddenly stop growing rings, and it'll miss a ring. And if it gets too excited, it'll produce what looks like 2 rings. So pine can be a pain. Tulip poplar, which is the other wood you get here, with that wood, it's purely dependent on how it grew. If it grew in good conditions, you get these really clear, beautiful rings. If anything happens to the tree, those rings suddenly all crunch into each other and you can't see the rings. So tulip poplar can be a pain. Chestnut, which you get a lot of buildings on the west side of Virginia of chestnut. Chestnut doesn't date at all. Its limiting factor isn't climate, it's something else. But there is an oak called chestnut oak, which looks just like chestnut if you don't know what you're looking at, and that dates wonderfully. So whenever people say to me, I've got a chestnut house, I always go and have a look, because it might be the chestnut oak house. And if they think I've got a chestnut house, or chestnut log house or whatever, I'll go and look just in case it isn't. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Thank you.
Is the assumption that the timbers or the wooden material used in the house construction is local to that geographic area? Because you could have window frames made in England, shipped over timbers from Maryland. Is that kind of the assumption?
There is sort of an assumption, but it's assumption I can back up. So basically, when you're looking at very old buildings, there's not a lot of people. They're not transporting stuff around so much. So basically, you've got a lot full of wood. They're just taking that wood and building the house. As you get later and later, the wood stops. You start running out of wood. Then you start getting wood shipped in from Pennsylvania. You get wood shipped in from the Carolinas. So you're constantly looking at the building, trying to work out, what wood stamp. If I do a building in Virginia with white pine in it, that pine does not grow in Virginia, does not grow in the Carolinas. It grows in New England. So I did a building. We were doing a slave building project with William and Mary, and basically they were looking at all these slave buildings. And one of those buildings is white pine. It comes from Boston. And it's shipped in, and you can find documents which basically say to a carpenter, go with this ship, with these timbers, with this framed house which we built, this was on the ship, go into the Carolinas, sell it. If you can't sell it, go down to the Caribbean, build it there, and come back on this ship. There are documents that say that kind of thing. And we know lots of wood from the Carolinas are going into the Caribbean and things like that. So we know there's wood moving around, but the assumption on a lot of the early buildings is it's local. And I'll see it because when I date it, if it doesn't match locally, I then run it against everything. And if it doesn't date then, I run it with everything I have in Europe. So like when we're doing ships, we don't know where the ship came from. So we basically will do the dendrochronology on the thing, make a good chronology for that ship, and then we run it against everything we have, every single piece of data. So the indigo we know came from Boston. We can almost work out which port it came from because it matches so well with material there. I've got the other big ship that was on the picture there. They think it comes from Europe. So basically, as soon as I get data for that, that will be sent off to the labs in Europe and see if they can match it. So, but the assumption is it's local. As you get later sawmills come in, you get things moving around. And the other place is cities, because there's no wood in cities. That wood obviously has come from somewhere else. So my house, the wood from my house came from Pennsylvania.
You mentioned the woods, Bolt Woods, I think it was, that had trees dating from 1730 that are still standing.
Yeah.
Where is that, or is it a secret?
I don't know. I didn't do it. It is a secret because Jack's dead. Yes. I don't know, but
Prince George's County.
It's in. Ask Silas. He might know.
Yeah, it's in Prince George's County, and it's actually a preserve.
Yeah.
Trees down.
Yeah. So lots of times when I did a similar project to this in England in Oxford, and basically what you do is you go and find the reserve. So Oxford University has study woodlands, and we basically, when we were working in Oxford, we went to their 4 study woodlands where no one can go in unless you've got a permit to working there. And those trees tend to be, they've been saved initially because they're older trees, and we work on those. So we're not just knocking on, hey, have you got any old trees? We're actually been a bit more selective on how we're finding those sites.
Does it make a difference where the tree has grown? Is it down in a ravine or is it out in a woods?
Absolutely, absolutely. So basically, if you've got the wood, so the samples we're getting from here, the ones that Jack did, they only date sort of around the eastern shore, a little bit into the western shore, a little bit into the eastern shore, a little bit into Virginia. When you start getting into the mountains towards the Shenandoah, they don't match at all. But if you get samples from this side of the Shenandoah Mountains, so the west side of Virginia, not West Virginia, the west side of Virginia, those samples, because the trees are higher, on higher ground, it's nearer the edge of the range of those trees, they actually pick up the climate much better, and they will match right across Virginia. So yeah, it does. Yeah.
Where does all this data reside? Is there one national database, or is it all distributed? How do you go about
So
matching a sample?
good question. So there is a data. If I do work for the federal government, all my data has to go to NOAA, and they have a database where they have every single project the government has funded, and that data goes online, and you can go online and you can download it. The stuff that we're doing on the individual buildings tends to be owned by the laboratory, so I own my data. I have no, so I have my own data, and I share my data with other labs. So when I left England, every single set of data I had went to the university that does climate change. They were doing a big climate change thing. So basically I went with a hard drive to the university, big pile of reports, and said, right, that's my data. There you go, guys, have fun. So over here we do it, if somebody's doing, I'm in New England at the moment, there's some guy doing, I half read the email. He sent me an email yesterday. He's doing a project looking at something about trees in New England, and he wants all my data. So in the next few days, I'll be sending all my data to him so he can do his study. And I'll, when the report comes out, I'll be the 10th authorship on it because it's my data. So that's how it works. The problem with dendrochronology, though, is it's a bit like chess. You can learn chess in an afternoon, but to be good at chess will take the rest of your life. And dendrochronology is very much like that. So the problem with people think I can date. I actually had a guy the other day who basically rang me up and said, I've been trying to date my house and I can't do it because he's read it and thinks it's easy. But there's a lot of things it's a 4-year course to do my job. Let's be honest. It's a lot of work to do what I do, and there's so many factors and things that can affect that data that we don't actually allow it, if we can, out into the wild. If that makes any sense. Oh,
I don't really even know who he is, but when did
oh, he did it from 1979 into 1981. Yeah.
Do you have cases where you don't have trees as old as the culture kind of?
Yeah, so what we do when we don't have trees, what we try to do then is, so like what you try to do then is you try to get the nearest place where we do have buildings, get as many buildings as we possibly can in one area, crunch that data together. That makes a much cleaner set, and that will start matching further away. So then we'll jump away from that area, try and date something else, some more buildings, and basically you sort of creep out if you don't have the trees. So you use the data you have and you sort of creep from it. So like I'm creeping down into the Carolinas. I'm not going in and taking new tree samples in the Carolinas. I'm basically trying to work out if I can get the samples I've got for North Carolina to match South Carolina.
You showed us at the beginning these pieces of paper with marks on them and whatnot.
Yeah.
I imagine the technology has progressed. And what is it now? Do you have automatic tree ring readers and big data sets?
Yeah, so when I trained, it was a microscope. Those guys are basically doing it with a little eyepiece. I have a microscope connected to a computer. Basically, I can't remember the last time I drew a graph. When I trained, I did a lot of graph work because it's like the base fundamentals of my job. But now it's all done with computers. In actual fact, I'm at the moment having the programs written so they'll use AI, artificial intelligence, so that it's going onto the IBM computer. See whether we can do things where I can throw data in and it comes out with the report written. That's my dream. So yeah, basically, and that's one of the reasons you get this slow shift from the East Coast to the West Coast, because it's so difficult to do graphs, date graphs. You know, even the early computers, the very early computers, when you would put two sets of data in, you go away for 2 weeks, come back, and then you get your result. Where now I can I can press a button and it'll compare thousands. And now with modern AI, it'll be instantaneous, that I can match every single set of data in the world against my site. Be great for ships. And what we're now trying to do is actually tie that to GIS and try and work out if we can work out the sort of microclimates where different things will be different. So basically, sometimes the areas chronologists work aren't just this is where I'm working, it's a circle around it. It can be funny shapes, but if you know what that shape is, you know that if you might be able to work out, if you go down south and do some buildings up in the mountains, they might help you date buildings on the flat somewhere else, if that makes any sense. So, yeah.
And Michael,
Yeah.
Jack did almost all of that by hand, right? He didn't have much computer systems.
He did have computer systems, but he checked and double-checked and treble-checked by hand. So the computer, he had Fortran programs written. And I've got those Fortran programs. Actually got a Fortran translator translating them at the moment. But basically, he did use programs, but he also constantly checked by doing graphs. So he used to have, say this was his office wall. He had a big, long office, narrower than this, but almost as long as this. And he basically had his chronologies taped to the wall. His computer would say it's such and such, and he would literally walk down the wall and go, I'm not sure about that, and go back to the computer and do a bit more. It's true. I've actually got one of them. It's just like, it's like 30 foot long, this thing. It's ridiculous. But okay, we done?
Good job.
Cool.